Welcome everyone to Wednesday Night at the Lab. I'm Tom Zinnan. I work here at the UW-Madison Biotechnology Center. I also work for UW Extension and Cooperative Extension. And on behalf of those folks and our other co-organizers, Wisconsin Public Television, the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and the UW-Madison Science Alliance, thanks again for coming to Wednesday Night at the Lab. We do this every Wednesday night, 50 times a year. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Richard Amasino. He's in the Department of Biochemistry here. He was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, went to high school near there in Greensburg, Pennsylvania. Got his undergraduate degree in Penn State, did his PhD at Indiana University, then went to the University of Washington in Seattle for a postdoc, and then 31 years ago, in 1985, came here to be on the faculty of the Department of Biochemistry, and he's been here ever since. He's a member of the National Academy of Science. He participated over the last 2 years in a National Academy of Science review on genetically modified organisms, and he's here tonight to talk to us about genetically engineered crops, or GMOs, fact or fiction. Please join me in welcoming Richard Amasino to Wednesday Night at the Lab.
Okay, thanks for the introduction and the invitation. As Tom said, I was recently on a study about genetically engineered crops sponsored by the National Academy of Sciences, so Tom asked me to talk about that. My own research doesn't involve genetically engineering crops. We work on understanding how plants respond to seasonal change by flowering at certain times of year, and maybe Tom will have me back sometime to talk about my own research. But tonight, I want to thank you all for coming on this cold night, and I want to say a little bit about genetically engineered organisms in general and crops in particular. First, just a brief intro. What is a genetically modified or genetically engineered organism? And the general definition is it's an organism that has had its genome manipulated, typically by recombinant DNA methods in a laboratory, and something that's done in a laboratory is then transferred into the genome of an organism. And there are many examples of this. I wanted to start with one of the very first examples, not plants, but then we'll move into crops. And one of the very first examples of genetic engineering was taking the human gene for insulin and placing it in a bacteria so that insulin could be made in bacteria rather than being produced from organs of animals. Eli Lilly was the first company to do this on a large scale. This is the product. And this is not as controversial as genetically engineering of crops. It's a much superior product. It's more pure, and it's exactly human insulin so that it doesn't cause certain reactions in people, diabetics, who need to take this drug. So it's a product that's been around for decades. The study I was on is, this is the cover page of the report, which was almost 400 pages. And at the Wednesday Night at the Lab website, I've posted a link to the report. You can download it for free or read it online, as well as a link to a summary of the report and one recent criticism of the report that appeared in a scientific journal, if you're interested in further reading. One of the aspects of genetically engineering crops that most of you, I suspect, have heard of is to control weeds. That weeds are a problem in agriculture. Crops grow a lot better if weeds are eliminated. And shown here is just an example of a crop on your left where there isn't weed control, and one where weeds have been controlled by an herbicide on the right. You can see a striking difference. And a major form of weed control in the major crops in this country and many countries around the world is Roundup. So again, I suspect most of you have heard of Roundup as an herbicide, and Roundup-ready crops, whether it's soybean, corn, cotton, and several others. This all started, the genetic engineering of crops, back in the 90s. Monsanto filed a patent on a particular gene that, when introduced into plants, would confer resistance to this particular herbicide, commonly called Roundup. Its more formal name is glyphosate. And it's basically putting in an enzyme. There's an enzyme in plants that's critical for a certain metabolic function, making amino acids for proteins, that the herbicide disables that enzyme. That's why it kills weeds. But if genetically engineered crops have a version of the enzyme that is immune to the effects of the herbicide, then those plants thrive. So it's a very simple concept, a single gene put into plants to give them an enzyme that's resistant to the herbicide. One thing when we're thinking about genetically engineered crops, and in the end I'll touch on some of the issues to the public about this, is if you're a company like Monsanto, the question is, who are the customers? And the customers are obviously those farmers who buy the seeds and favor certain products for a variety of reasons. In this case, this particular herbicide provides very effective weed control. And on the scale of agricultural chemicals, is a rather safe chemical to use. So it has advantages to the customers. Farmers are smart people, and that's why they like the product. Also, and I should say, I meant to say this at the beginning, I'm going to go through a lot of issues about genetically engineered crops. I want to give you a range of the types of things that are out there, some of the issues that are out there. But I'm not here to reach any conclusions. I want to just present a lot of information to you and let you draw conclusions. One of the criticisms sometimes levied against genetically engineered crops is that the traits that have been deployed aren't solving major problems for the world, but that they're actually just protecting yield for farmers, because that's actually something farmers, the customers, want. And so most of the GE crops deployed to date are either herbicide resistance, and a major one is Roundup, or resistance to insects as well. And I just mentioned the herbicide resistance, and I wanted to quickly tell you about a major category of how genetically engineered crops are insect resistant. So this is actually a picture of a bollworm eating cotton. And in many crops, insects are obviously a problem. It's been known for a long time that there are bacteria that make proteins that are toxic to insects, but not toxic at all to animals. And this is a class of bacteria that are known as Bacillus thuringiensis. So there's a certain protein called the Bt protein because it comes from Bacillus thuringiensis that's quite toxic to plants. And this has been used in plant protection in a wide range of ways. For example, it's used commonly in organic farming, again, because it's a protein that's not at all toxic to animals, including us, so that it can be used right up until harvest without any worry about effects on the consumers of those plants. What's been done by genetic engineering is to express that bacterial protein in plants. And so shown here is the effect of, on the left is a normal plant, not genetically engineered. The insect, the caterpillar stage is growing very well. Shown on your right is a caterpillar trying to feed on the plant expressing this bacterial protein, and its growth is severely stunted. In other words, it provides very effective control of insects. And there's a lot of different types of Bt proteins that provide resistance against a wide range of insects. And this includes soil-borne pests. These particular proteins, for example, can provide resistance against nematodes. In some agricultural areas, nematodes in the soil devastate root systems. So this can provide effective control against that problem. One of the things that the committee was tasked to look at, and I should have added, this was a large committee of people who are ecologists, economists, sociologists, a few lawyers, and several basic scientists like myself, a few people who study toxicology and so forth. looked at a wide range of issues. One was whether there was anything unique to genetically engineered plants that would create environmental risks. And there was no evidence that there was anything unique. I'll mention more at the end. Of course, agriculture itself has a big effect on the environment, but genetically engineered crops did not seem to have any additional environmental issues. One, for example, herbicides have been in use for a long time before genetic engineering. Genetic engineering just enables a particular herbicides like Roundup to be used. But herbicides have been in agriculture, as I'm sure most of you know, for decades before genetic engineering came into play. Some of the concerns that have been out there, you might have read about some of these, is whether genetically engineered crops that, for example, express this Bt protein that's toxic to insects might be responsible for the decline in monarch butterflies that's been occurring. For example, pollen from corn plants could blow over to the food of monarch butterflies, which is milkweed, and they might consume the toxins from stray pollen. Turns out not to be the case, although it's certainly the case that monarchs are in a drastic decline. They're a remarkable organism, and I hope we don't lose them. But the culprit, in part, there's many reasons why they're declining. Loss of habitat in places where they overwinter, like Mexico. But a contributing factor is the efficiency of modern agriculture, that there simply aren't the levels of their food source, milkweed, which is a weed, that there used to be. So it's an indirect effect of things like genetically engineered crops that agriculture is getting more efficient, reducing the populations of milkweed on which the monarchs feed, but it's not a direct effect. We might have this same issue of declining monarchs if other conventional herbicides were used and killed off a lot of the food source for the butterfly. And of course, there's lots of examples of extinction in our lifetimes, not just things due to agriculture. In my own lifetime, there's been many remarkable animals and other organisms on this planet go extinct, like a very interesting dolphin that in the last decade was declared extinct. Now, I wanted to turn to some of the examples of genetic engineering that you might be hearing about soon that aren't in major crops like corn and soybean. One example is blight-resistant chestnuts. It used to be that not all that long ago, the eastern forests of the United States, chestnut was a dominant tree. They contributed a lot to the ecosystems. Shown on the map is the range of extensive chestnut in forests. But as you know, there was a blight of chestnut introduced from Asia, and it's essentially, it hasn't driven the chestnut extinct. They still exist as rootstocks that keep trying to throw up shoots, but the shoots are killed off by the blight. By transferring a gene, I believe, from wheat into chestnut, scientists in New York were able to create a blight-resistant chestnut. So one of the issues is whether this genetically engineered chestnut should be reintroduced to restore ecosystems to what they had been several decades ago. Another example of using genetic engineering to improve nutrition that's been in the news a lot is the so-called golden rice, adding the precursor to vitamin A into rice. So people in poor parts of the world who don't get sufficient vitamin A can get it through this staple of their diet, rice. So this was done independently of companies and was recently recognized both by the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy with the winner of the Patents for Humanity Award, as well as by the Pope. There have been some issues about whether this ought to be deployed that I'll talk about soon, that a lot of the public is resistant to anything that's been genetically engineered in this way. even if it could help a lot of people. There are projects to develop more drought-tolerant crops for Africa, where drought takes a very huge hit on crop yields. And just one other example is that back in the 1990s, the papaya industry in Hawaii was almost wiped out by a virus that arose. And by putting in a single protein that confers resistance to the virus, the papaya industry was saved in Hawaii. But any papayas coming from Hawaii have been genetically engineered to resist the virus. One final example from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh is insect-resistant eggplant. Eggplant is a major vegetable in these countries, mostly grown by poor farmers who, like this individual shown in the image, do hand spraying. They carry tanks of insecticide on their back, spray their crops to protect it against insects with very little protection and at great risk to the farmers as well as their family members who help them. Again, by putting that bacterial protein into eggplant, there are now eggplant varieties that are resistant to damage, and the farmers don't need to spray with insecticides. And the eggplants are more nutritious and command more money at market too, so the subsistence farmers have more income. This was a joint project by government scientists in these countries. It turns out, though, although it was a joint project of Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, only Bangladesh so far has approved the use of these genetically engineered eggplant because there's resistance in the other countries from the public not wanting farmers to have access to these genetically engineered eggplant to sell in those countries. And as you know, there's a lot of concern in any crop, especially those that humans consume directly. Although the papaya industry was saved in the late 1990s by genetically engineered papaya, there's been a recent increase in protest against papaya being genetically engineered in Hawaii. So one question that the public often asks is, are genetically engineered crops safe? And one of the findings from the committee, we reviewed all the evidence that was available to us, studies from around the world, that there was no substantiated evidence of any different risk to human health between genetically engineered crops and any other type of crop. In other words, there's been no evidence of any human health effects from the consumption of genetically engineered crops directly or products derived from them. But maybe that's not a complete answer to are GE crops safe. But that's really a difficult question to answer, and it's maybe not the right question to ask. Asking whether or not GE crops are safe is a little bit like asking, or a lot like asking the question, are toys safe? And if I was to ask any of you, are toys safe, I think you'd pause and say, well, that's not the greatest question. We have to ask, is this toy or that toy safe? Not are toys in general safe. You might look at that rubber duck and think it's safe, but if someone considered this knife a toy, I think we'd all agree it's not safe. In other words, the real question is a particular toy safe? And so far, every genetically engineered crop that's been developed to date has been safe. It's gone through extensive testing, approval by government agencies, and so forth. In other words, it's been scrutinized rather heavily. And from a scientific perspective, when things are scrutinized, sometimes you don't find the answer you'd expect. For example, a book was written about the hidden hazards in our lives, and the cover of this book was about rubber ducks made the cover because some rubber ducks have been found to have lead or other harmful chemicals in them. So it's not necessarily what appears on the surface. Another question might be, are we 100% certain that genetically engineered crops are safe? Again, in science, I don't think any scientist would like to say or would be willing to say that we can look at anything with 100% certainty. Again, our conclusion of the study is that there's been no documented effects on human health or animal health from any genes that have been put into plants. On the other hand, there are many examples of things that we consume that might have health effects. And I'm just going to give you a few random examples. But here's a title of a scientific paper about caffeine causing aneuploidy. That's what happens when cells don't distribute the chromosomes during cell division properly. And that caffeine can cause the chromosomal segregation of cells to screw up. Aneuploidy is a risk factor for cancer. This was a study published in the journal Cancer Science. Now, if someone, and these were studies in cultured cells, by the way, if someone found this type of result with a protein that was genetically engineered into a plant, probably that product would never be on the market. But caffeine is abundantly on the market. Probably many of you, like me, have had a cup or two of coffee today. Should you worry? No. This is an in-the-lab study, and the caffeine amounts applied to these cells were rather high. But we can be pretty certain caffeine's safe simply because there's been a huge experiment done for many decades on people. We know that we can compare people who drink coffee with those who don't, and through epidemiology, look for any effects. And so far, there's absolutely no evidence. And given the large number of people who consume caffeine, I suspect by now, if there was any evidence of harmful effects at the level that people consume caffeine, it would have shown up. Sorolins are a nasty chemical in celery. Here's just one title of a scientific paper looking at effects of sorolins on interfering with reproductive aspects of reproduction. Again, at the levels most people consume celery, it's not to worry, but celery has caused some health problems for people who are farm workers harvesting celery, or those who handle large amounts of it in grocery stores. Again, it's not taken off the market, but it does have a fairly toxic chemical in it. Just one other example. Kiwi is a relatively recently introduced fruit into the human diet because breeders converted kiwi into something fairly recently that's attractive to eat. Now, a lot of people do have allergic reactions to kiwi. It's not a reason to take it off the market, but we understand the protein in it that does cause allergic reactions. So again, the conclusion there is genetically engineered crops so far have no health effects. That's not to say that someone couldn't conceive of a genetically engineered crop in the future that might put in something that could cause health effects. But again, the testing ought to get at that. That's done. Now I wanted to talk a little bit about what I think are some of the reasons that many people object to genetic engineering of plants and other organisms. And especially in the food supply, there's certainly, human history has a record of many mistakes in other realms. There haven't been any mistakes in genetic engineering of crops, but there's been many mistakes in other realms, and these mistakes can foster mistrust of technologies. Just a few examples. We go back a ways that X-rays, you used to find X-ray machines in shoe stores, could look at your bones and help fit the shoe. Probably wasn't necessary, and it wasn't appreciated at the time, the risk of X-rays in terms of mutagenizing DNA. X-rays are important for some diagnoses, but as we all know now, it's important to limit exposure. Another example, lead in paint. This is actually an old ad from the Dutch Boy Paint Company. And this really isn't science not recognizing things. At the time, most countries were banning lead, but US companies started a campaign to avoid that ban in the United States. And it included even coloring books for kids, touting the benefits of lead in many products. And while the rest of the world was banning lead in paint in the 1920s, it took until 1978 for that to occur in the United States. Many drugs have looked promising and then been pulled off the market later when side effects show up, whether it's the diabetes drug Resolin or some of the anti-inflammatories that have caused heart disease. Another aspect of concern on the public is there's really an ocean these days of misinformation. And it's really impossible for the public, I think, to sort through this information. They're not experts in distinguishing what's fake news or fake science from what's actual science. And I just wanted to show you some examples of the types of things you can readily find if you go to the web and try to look for information on this. So back to this very successful herbicide, Roundup, which remember is glyphosate. You can find many sources that have headlines like the following: MIT doctor reveals a link between glyphosate, GMOs, and the autism epidemic. And so, well, MIT is a very prestigious institution, and a doctor from MIT, it sounds pretty convincing. However, this MIT doctor has a PhD, but the PhD is not a medical doctor. It's a PhD in electrical engineering. This is not a faculty member, but a person whose day job is to work in a computer lab, and this is done outside of MIT, the actual MIT work. There has been a rise in diagnosed cases of autism recently, and there could be many reasons for this, including just better diagnosis, but that's off topic of what we're talking about tonight. But in publications from this person, you will find these correlations showing a very striking correlation between the increase in use of Roundup, or the Roundup herbicide, and diagnosed cases of autism. But we all know that correlations don't prove a case. And in fact, you can look at data like this and think, well, how could we look at this in more detail, more meaningful? Well, one way would be to look at those children who might have greater exposure to Roundup. In other words, children who live in rural areas where Roundup is used, or the children of farmers. There's absolutely no difference in cases of autism there versus those who live in regions in cities where would be very little exposure. Or we looked at data, for example, on the committee of other countries where Roundup has never been used, such as England. So there's no exposure there, yet this increase in diagnosed cases of autism is the same in England as it is in the United States. And of course, one could make similar correlations in many realms. You also see a perfect correlation between increasing organic food sales and autism, as well as sales of things like flat screen TVs and autism. I mean, there's a lot of things that have increased over the period of, say, the late 90s into around 2009. And even sources that I consider somewhat reputable, occasionally will have an employee who has a certain point of view that they want to get across. And I was surprised to find Consumer Reports has actually been on a bit of a crusade against genetically modified plants. So these are some quotes from Consumer Reports that genetically modified plants could is a very important qualifier here, but not one that, it's one that the public tends to forget after they've read something, could introduce toxins or new allergens. And if plants did have new toxins or new allergens, of course, onto the second quote, they might cause damage to the immune system or liver or kidneys or any other organ. But the fact of the matter is the record is a perfect one so far in genetically engineered crops. There just haven't been any examples of this. But I will say to you that if I wanted to express a toxin in plants, we certainly have the technical know-how to do that. I could take a toxin. I could genetically engineer a plant to produce it. There's no reason why a company would want to do that, but it is possible to do for sure. Another thing that many people encounter is frightening symbolism. There are many organizations that have taken a strong stance against genetically engineered plants. Greenpeace is among them. And again, I don't know what the basis of this is, but it certainly helps sometimes in fundraising. I think one of the reasons, too, that there might be some resistance or objections, and one that science really can't answer, is this issue of whether it's wrong to tamper with nature. Certainly, genetic engineering is often moving a gene from, say, a human to a bacterium to make insulin, or from a bacterium that has a wonderful insecticide or a very effective insecticide into a plant. These are things that would be unlikely to occur in nature. And I wanted to note that there's, of course, we've been, in a sense, tampering with nature for about as long as humans have been around. One example is just plant breeding. I don't think this slide shows up very well in this conditions, but shown on the left is wild grass that grows in Central America called teosinte. And plant breeders over centuries have converted it into corn. So these are very related plants. So that's an example from the plant world of making a big change. Of course, humans have taken this majestic creature, the wolf, and turned it into many things, such as that. It was only about 15,000 years ago that humans domesticated wolves and created the incredible range of breeds of dogs from them that we have today. Another example would be turkeys bred into their modern forms that are balls of meat. But another example I wanted to give is just, or actually two quick examples, is that although it's rare, we do find many cases in nature of genes being transferred from organisms that could never breed in nature. So the Asian Longhorn beetle is an invader into this country that's becoming a very serious pest in eastern forests. It's decimating hardwoods. It turns out the genome of this devastating insect was recently sequenced, in part to see if there might be any clues as to ways to combat it. But this, one of the reasons it's a devastating pest is that it can digest wood. It turns out it was discovered that this insect had acquired at some point in its evolutionary history genes from fungi that are able to digest wood. So its ability for it to digest wood comes from somehow acquiring genes from fungi. Another example, and this was a headline when this was discovered, there are some beautiful sea slugs in the Atlantic Ocean that they eat seaweed and they keep the chloroplast, the photosynthesizing parts of the algae that they eat, and they keep the chloroplast functioning in their own bodies so that these slugs actually become plant-like in that they can have the chloroplast producing sugars for them and can go long times without feeding because the chloroplasts are photosynthesizing. Well, it turns out not only do they acquire chloroplasts from some of the seaweed that they eat, but they actually have acquired in their own genomes some of the necessary genes from the algae that they eat that are able to keep the chloroplasts alive. So somehow in the course of their evolution, they've become genetically engineered to contain algal genes in order to carry out this interesting way of life, of acquiring chloroplasts. And of course, in other realms, we are tampering with nature. Agriculture itself has a huge impact on nature. And other aspects of modern industrialization, of course, are having huge impacts on nature, including, hopefully not, but possibly the extinction of many very wonderful, majestic species on this planet, like polar bears, if the Arctic ice in their habitat is depleted. The final thing I wanted to talk about, and then open it up for questions, is to ask the question, should labeling be required? This has been in the news on and off recently. Should labeling be required for foods with genetically modified ingredients? So currently we have a certain format of label that's determined by the FDA. And before I talk more about this, I just, if you don't mind, would like to take a survey. How many of you think we ought to label foods that have ingredients from genetic engineering? A few. Does anyone think we shouldn't? And the other category would be you really haven't thought about it, which is several. And I'm not sure where I stand on the matter. On the one hand, I feel strongly that the public has a right to know certain things. But on the other hand, labeling, at least done in certain ways, would imply that there's a reason to label, a health reason. And that could be very misleading because, again, there's absolutely no scientific evidence for a health reason, for any health effects of genetically engineered products. So that a label could be very misleading to a lot of the public. Now, of course, many companies, and by the way, at least this type of label is required by the FDA, but the FDA is only allowed to require things on labels for scientific and health reasons. So in fact, if there aren't any health reasons that are science-based, then the FDA doesn't have the authority to require this on the FDA label. On the other hand, and you've probably seen this in grocery stores, many companies are doing some labeling of their own. Just a few examples here. Recently, the candy company, Hershey, has stopped using any sugar that's produced from sugar beets because the sugar beet crop in the United States does come largely from a genetically engineered variety of sugar beet. So this was a headline from the Minneapolis Star Tribune. And of course, locally, they're worried about this because in Minnesota and some of the states around there, sugar beets are a fairly major crop. So there's concern that a lot of farmers are going to be in trouble, unable to sell the sugar produced from their sugar beets. A lot of this was driven on the part of Hershey's decision by many groups who had campaigns to remove any products of genetically engineered crops from the food supply. These are just some examples of some of the groups that have led such campaigns to actually encourage or almost force Hershey's to do this. I was just on a Delta flight last week, and there was an article about the CEO of General Mills. And there was a little part about genetically engineered crops in it. He was asked about it. And here's a quote from his response, that GMOs are one of the most studied ingredients in food history. There's no documented bad health consequences. That's all of the science. But we're not here to argue with our consumers. So in fact, Cheerios, a General Mills product, does have on the label not made with genetically modified ingredients. It turns out there's no such thing as genetically modified oats, so you couldn't get genetically modified oats if you wanted them. But there are other ingredients there as well, too, so they don't use genetically modified sugar or other things in the product. So if consumers drive this, then farmers who might want the ability to use genetically engineered crops will, of course, be forced not to use them. There are some other products, just one other example of a recent product that we'll see if it's adopted, because a lot of the potatoes produced in the country go to restaurants like McDonald's and other places. There's a company called Simplot. They've actually genetically engineered a potato by inactivating some genes, but doing so with genetic engineering techniques so that the potatoes don't brown or when bruised, but also don't produce a toxin called acrylamide when cooked under high heat. So cooking potatoes does, at some low level, produce something that's pretty toxic, acrylamide. And so they've modified the biochemistry of the potato to greatly reduce the amount of this toxin produced when you fry potatoes. In other words, it's a product, if you like French fries, that's going to make, it's going to reduce your load of consumption of this toxin. We'll see if this gets adopted. So that was where I wanted to end. It was just a quick tour, and I hope that I have left time for some questions if you have them. So thank you. Yes?
One of the concerns I've heard about Roundup is that it leads to a monoclonal culture, and there are risks, long-term risks in having monoclonal culture in crops. Could you comment on that?
Yes, that's a great question. So the question is that will things like Roundup lead to monocultures, which means that we'll only have one variety of corn being grown, and therefore we lose some of the diversity in corn. And so I have a couple things to say about that. First of all, there are companies that do produce, say, Roundup-resistant corn. It's not just one variety. They're still breeding corn varieties that are best suited, say, for Minnesota, other varieties best suited for Texas, and so on. So you still have to maintain the diversity to adapt your other aspects of the corn plant to the range of places corn is grown. But it's certainly the case that modern agriculture and the consolidation in the agricultural industry can lead to less diversity. If one company had pretty much controlled the entire corn seed industry in the United States or the world, I think there'd be less diversity in corn than if there were many, many more companies. Balancing that, though, it's in any company's best interest to keep diversity around, even if it's not incorporated in this year's corn. You need to keep that around for the future. So it's a complicated question, but we certainly see in many industries, not just in agriculture, consolidation. And this is beyond my area of expertise, but many of our economic policies, not only in this country and worldwide, are contributing to consolidation in many industries. So that, I didn't answer the question fully. Certainly, genetic diversity is critical in any crop to maintain because we don't know what we're going to need in the future. And so to what extent genetic engineering contributes to this? Certainly if a company, so the final thing I ought to say about it is if a company develops a superior product, be it a Roundup Ready crop or an iPhone, they're going to get a larger market share and control more of that market because they have a product that their customers want. And that's simply the way things are going to play out.
Let me just
Yeah.
follow up. I think
Sure.
the risk that I've heard is that you end up with a large proportion of the crop, let's say corn, that is Roundup ready, and that at some future time, 10, 20 years from now, there's some other blight that wipes out.
Yes, yes. But what I was trying to say, and let me try to do a better job of it, is that having Roundup Ready in corn doesn't mean the corn grown in Minnesota is the same otherwise genetically as the corn grown in Texas or Nebraska. It is different, and it's in companies' best interests to maintain a lot of genetic diversity in their breeding programs so that they're ready to produce corn that's going to work 20 years from now. Another way to reframe your question is there a danger that companies won't be farsighted and won't be thinking about wanting to have varieties ready to deal with whatever needs to be dealt with 20 years from now? And certainly, consolidation in any industry runs that risk. That if there's more players, there's more, I think there's a greater probability of maintaining diversity or different ideas or whatever, for sure. But I will assure you that companies are aware of the diversity issue, and it's in their best interest to maintain it in their breeding programs. Yes?
Thanks for a great talk. I had a question about open source seeds versus patents, and I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Well, that's a broad thing to talk about. The system is, and I don't know much about the legalities of it, or, I'm a basic scientist in a biochemistry department, but certainly we have a system that enables things like the development of a Roundup resistance gene to be patented, and a company therefore has the right to control the seeds that contain that particular patented item. And in certain realms, there are open source seeds that aren't covered by any patents. That's one of the things that universities can provide an alternative to farmers if they want things that aren't patent protected. It's one vital role that universities can play. I'm not sure what else you'd like me to say about that.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Okay. Tom.
During the course of the panel study, we went from having Fallon's to having CRISPR gene editing techniques that are distinctly different from the gene transfer. What was the panel's conclusions or recommendations on regulating that kind of technology? It doesn't necessarily introduce genes from some other organism, but changes, edits, modifies, whatever you want, genes from an existing plant.
Well, the question Tom's asking is about an area called gene editing. There's been recent advances in understanding some of how bacteria defend themselves that have revealed the systems by which you can introduce proteins into organisms that will, for example, change a single base in DNA. And so this is being used. Some of you may have read some reports just in the last, I think 6 months or so, maybe a little bit, certainly in this year, 2016, about a gene-edited mushroom where a gene has been just altered very slightly. There's a sweet corn developed by gene editing, where again, a gene has been disabled by a very minor change in the gene. These gene editing techniques are, so far how they've been used, are creating the same changes that would occur in nature at some low frequency. To give you an example from humans, every time a child is born, they have probably about, I think, 10,000 genetic differences from either of their parents, simply due to errors in replication of DNA. In other words, the DNA wasn't replicated perfectly. So far, these gene editing changes that have been done are ones that would occur naturally by that process of errors in DNA replication. Gene editing enables a scientist or a company to go in and find those, create them so they know where they are, rather than looking at, say, 10 million plants to try to find where it might have happened randomly. So gene editing, as it's used so far, is simply doing things that occur all the time in nature. And therefore, that doesn't mean things that happen in nature might not be something that ought to be regulated. I didn't touch on regulation in what I presented, but I will make one statement. The committee's conclusion was that things ought to be regulated based on a scientific assessment of their novelty, the likelihood that they might pose a risk. Changing a base in DNA could create a different protein that might have an allergic reaction. So it's not simply that you've gene edited or put in a gene. There ought to be a more rational system that looks at the likelihood of risk and regulates accordingly. So I could think of a single change in a base of DNA that would change a protein that might create a protein that now has causes an allergic reaction in some people. That ought to be looked at, and frankly, any company that does this is thinking about that, regardless of whether they have to pass it through the USDA or not. Yes?
In your Bangladesh eggplant example, was that open source so that the farmers could keep their own seed?
Oh, yes, yes. Thank you for, that's a great question. Yeah, this was a consortium of government scientists funded by the governments to produce an eggplant that was insect resistant. So it seemed like a great idea to the government agencies that funded it, the scientists that did it, but then, and they successfully did it. But then, as I mentioned, only one of the three countries so far has permitted it to be used. Yes?
Earlier you used the example of the X-ray machine on shoe fitting.
Yes.
And at the time, we didn't know any better. We didn't think there would be a problem
Right.
doing it. Looking at GMOs now, obviously it's hard to know what we don't know, but are there areas of investigation that we should be following before we declare them completely safe?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it gives me a chance to maybe say what I was trying to say in a more concise way. So when we genetically engineer a plant, or when companies do, they know exactly what they've done. There's, for example, a new protein, like the Bt protein from an insect. And that Bt protein had been dusted on plants that humans have been consuming for decades prior to it being actually produced by the plant. So that's somewhat similar to the fact that a huge number of people have been drinking coffee for a long time. You know, is coffee completely safe? Maybe not. Maybe if we had great resolving power in epidemiology, we'd see a slight risk for this or that. But there's nothing that rises above our level of noise in terms of coffee consumption or tea consumption. I could give you 5 Wednesday night at the labs listing all the toxic things that plants produce that we consume. There's no zero risk. But in the cases of genetically engineered crops, we do know precisely what has been done. And in fact, this relates to Tom's question. In some countries like Canada, if a breeder does a lot of wide crosses, you know, maybe takes a tomato plant that's a native plant, not a tomato that's consumed, but a relative from South America, and crosses it with a tomato for consumption to try to bring in disease resistance. We've shuffled, or that breeder has shuffled thousands of genes and doesn't even know what they are. In Canada, that would be a regulated product, because from a scientific perspective, there's a great chance that there might be a lot of changes there with unforeseen consequences. And that tomato would be subject to regulation. In the United States, it's not, because it hasn't been genetically engineered. So again, our report calls for thinking about this from a relative risk perspective and looking at the novelty of what's been done versus just genetic engineering per se. Yes.
Does science need to do a better job of getting this message out?
So the question is, should science do a better job of getting this message out? Well, first of all, I hope that what I've tried to do tonight, and I hope that I've done an okay job of it, is try not to be too judgmental. I just wanted to give you a tour of things that are happening and some of the reasons I feel there is concern. It's becoming increasingly difficult to get certain messages out because there's so much noise these days with headlines like MIT doctor shows link between autism and Roundup use. But certainly scientists could always do a better job of it. We need to do a better job against a background where it's becoming more difficult. And that's true in many realms, whether it's all the fake news we've heard about recently that doesn't have to do with science. Scientific issues have a similar problem, a similar hurdle to overcome. Yes?
I was going to want to talk about the Roundup Ready plants, the crops, and I've been hearing that the weeds are becoming Roundup Ready as well. I mean, if that's true, is there some sort of a mechanism operating between these other crops and the weeds? I mean,
Yes, so that's a great question. Thank you. The question has to do with weeds becoming resistant to Roundup and other herbicides. That's certainly the case. And it's perfectly similar to various pathogens becoming resistant to antibiotics. If you put chemicals out into the environment or into humans or into farm animals, in the case of antibiotics, you're creating a strong, what evolutionary biologists call selective pressure, so that when mutations arise that confer resistance, they get selected for and they spread through a population. And so 2 points. One, just a little digression perhaps. Even before humans were growing crops, Roundup Ready weeds were arising on this planet because those occur from the mistakes in DNA replication that I mentioned earlier. But it's only when humans put a lot of Roundup into the environment that those mutations that arise have an advantage and they become the dominant weeds. So certainly, in my opinion, and this is the opinion of folks who study this, and I don't, that the companies that have sold herbicides could have done a better job of trying to work with farmers to use them in a more responsible way that lowered the rate of spread of resistance. On the other hand, when we're using any chemical, be it an antibiotic or an herbicide, in any way, we will be selecting for resistance. Whether it's an organic farmer using BT, dusting their crops, or a cotton farmer who has the genetically engineered crop with BT in it. The difference is now that BT, just like antibiotics in agriculture, in farm animals, is so widespread that the rate of a selective pressure, the rate at which these weeds are spreading, is quite high. And certainly there's valid concern of those in the organic farming community that using a product they had used for decades and now using it in such a broad way in cornfields all throughout Midwestern states is going to make their life more difficult because it's going to increase the frequency of spread of resistant weeds.
Any other questions? If not, thank you very much.
Thanks for the